Welcome to the QFF Business Hour, where we discuss farm business issues. Join us on the last Wednesday of each month at 4 p.m. to engage with industry and professional business advisors to assist you in building your strategic management capacity to prepare for and manage businesses and climate risks, as well as improve economic, environmental and social resilience. I wish to begin today's episode by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, seas and waters throughout Australia and pay respects to elders past, present and future. This session is made possible through the Future Drought Fund Farm Business Resilience Program, a jointly funded program by the Australian Government and the Queensland Drought and Climate Adaptation Program. Now, in this episode of the QFF Farm Business Hour, we will discuss the priority risk of biosecurity, which involves managing the risks and impacts associated with pests and diseases and plays a vital role in the safeguarding Queensland's agricultural industries. I'd now like to welcome today's panellists. We have Dr. Fiona Thompson, Director Response Preparedness, Animal Biosecurity and Welfare, Biosecurity Queensland, Department of Agriculture and Fisheries. Hello to you, Fiona.
Hi, Sally, and thanks for the invitation.
It's great to have you on board. And also Dr. Laurie Dowling, QFF Policy Advisor, Intensive Animal Industries. Thanks for joining us too, Laurie.
Yes, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks very much, Sally.
And Ian Atkinson, CEO, Nursery and Garden Industry Queensland. Great for your contribution as well, Ian.
Good afternoon to everybody.
Good afternoon. Managing biosecurity is fundamental to the prosperity of all Australians. Pests and diseases can pose a significant threat to our food, fibre and foliage. Australia's geographic isolation has earned us a clean green reputation as we are insulated from many of the pests and diseases affecting agriculture sectors overseas. A three-tiered biosecurity program that covers international borders, state borders and individual property boundaries sets out to safeguard Australian agriculture from pests and diseases, ensuring future profitability and sustainability of the sector. In recent times, there has been a transition to the understanding that biosecurity is a shared responsibility between government, industry, farmers and community. Producers play a key role in protecting Australia's plant and livestock industries from pests and diseases by implementing sound biosecurity measures on farm. For farmers, biosecurity is a daily concern, and today's panellists are experts in understanding and mitigating biosecurity risks faced by the agriculture sector. They are all highly skilled professionals with a deep knowledge and experience of various biological changes facing the industry, providing us with the picture of biosecurity future that we really need to prepare for, which is what this discussion is all about today. And to help kick us off today's session, I'd like to welcome our first panellist, Dr. Fiona Thompson, Director Response Preparedness, Animal Biosecurity and Welfare, Biosecurity Queensland. That's quite a title. Fiona joined the Queensland Government on the equine influenza eradication response in 2007. And over the years, Fiona has undertaken various roles with the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries, including developing Hendra virus policies and procedures, industry liaison, and multiple emergency responses. And in May 2018, Fiona was appointed as chair of the Veterinary Surgeons Board of Queensland, and her current role in the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries is Director of Response Preparedness. Wow, that was a lot of chat from me. I'm dying to hear from you guys. Fiona, welcome aboard. It's great to have you with us. My first question to you is, what are you seeing as the priority risk for animal biosecurity?
Thanks, Sally. Look, there are a number of factors at play that have elevated the threat of emergency animal diseases. For us in Queensland, I think you'd have to be living under a rock to not be aware of that increased threat at the moment. Look, there's some global factors that play into that, like climate change. There's some massive infrastructure projects in China and Southeast Asian ports that contribute to an increase in the biosecurity risk profile currently. Also, we're seeing outbreaks of foot and mouth disease, lumpy skin disease, and African swine fever in our northern neighbours. And so that means these diseases are geographically closer to Australia and Queensland than they've ever been before. The last time we had foot and mouth disease in Australia was 1872, so it's quite some time since that last major incident.
That's a big gap.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Which means our systems are in play. So yeah, look, it's sometimes, I guess, with these risk profiles, it's a hard sell asking producers and farmers to think about and put in actions in place for pests and diseases that we don't even have in the country. And we understand the time pressures everyone is under. So dealing with things that are here and present, but it's really important, and we definitely see emergency animal disease prevention and preparedness as a really high priority.
Yeah. And what precautionary measures can farmers take to minimise that risk?
Yeah, great question. And look, we are, and I know people are probably getting sick of it, we are banging on about it, but having a biosecurity management plan in place that takes into consideration emergency animal diseases is vital. So things like asking visitors if they've travelled overseas or if they're up to date with their flu vaccination before they come onto your property are really important additional steps to a biosecurity plan. A biosecurity plan is a big undertaking. It's an important undertaking. It's like an insurance policy. And yeah, look at the spot today. I can't do it justice. There's comprehensive information on biosecurity planning at the Animal Health Australia Farm Biosecurity website, and I'd encourage everyone to have a look through that information. We're also asking farmers to know the signs, know the clinical signs of the priority emergency animal diseases. So those current threats are things like foot and mouth disease, lumpy skin disease, African swine fever, and highly pathogenic avian influenza. Know those signs, know what to look for, and report any suspicion to their vet and also to the Emergency Animal Disease Watch hotline. So that number is 1800 675 888. You should all have that programmed into your phone. Early detection is vital to getting the best outcome if we were in the position of having an incursion. And lastly, I think one of the big take home is swill feeding. So that's the feeding of meat products, food that's been in contact with meat to pigs. So it is illegal in every state and territory in Australia. It's a high risk activity, and it's the most likely pathway for an outbreak of foot and mouth disease or African swine fever into Australia.
Yeah, so the key here is, from what I'm hearing, is just really understanding all the risks and knowing how to see them quickly, recognise them early.
Correct. Early detection is the key, and notifying, knowing what to look for, recognising that, and then letting somebody know. Critical time.
So knowing what to look for, then there's obviously that's the farmer's responsibility to just be educated, to understand what the first signs are.
That's right. Have that awareness there. It doesn't. Farmers are in a prime position. They know their animals. They're seeing them sometimes on a daily basis.
Yeah.
They should. They're in a prime position. But there's multiple areas at play. Coming together at congregation points, whether they be sale yards, whether they be abattoirs, processing facilities, showgrounds. There's other people that are laying eyes on those animals. So we're asking everybody to be aware.
Yeah, actually, yeah, that's right. A nice collective effort sort of helps, doesn't it?
Correct.
Okay, so let's talk about biosecurity incursion. So what should farmers be aware of in managing an animal biosecurity incursion, if it may happen?
Yes. So I guess if the worst were to happen, if we were to get a significant emergency animal disease, the importance of biosecurity measures during incursion are paramount. They would be ramped up. So activities like decontamination, come clean, go clean, record keeping, again, reporting suspicion during a response are all really, really vital. I guess a key strategy would be livestock and product movement controls or restrictions during a response, and they are a key strategy to the success of a response. So during a response, farmers would need to know the relevant zone or area that they're located, what can and can't be moved, and strictly following those movement restrictions. I guess some other things for, that maybe not everybody is aware of is, an obvious one with movement controls is likely to be supply chain issues. And in terms of emergency animal diseases, our status is reflected at a national level. So if there were one property infected with foot and mouth disease in Western Australia, that makes the whole of Australia an infected status. And so we would likely lose export markets until eradication was completed and proof of freedom was established.
So where there are stock losses or gaps in the supply chain, are these programs available to help farmers mitigate the financial cost of an incursion? Because that could be huge, I'd imagine.
Absolutely, and that's right. So there's been a lot of pre-thinking, a lot of planning preparedness. We have nationally agreed with industry and government agreements in place. And under those agreements and with state-based legislation, there are compensation options available for affected producers. And so these can include compensation for livestock that have died or been destroyed as part of the official response, but also property and equipment as well that's been damaged or destroyed as part of the official response. Usually consequential losses such as loss of profit, loss of markets won't be compensated. Also, with a significant response, along the lines of a foot and mouth disease or an African swine fever, it's likely that we'd see relief packages as well. So we saw that during equine influenza. There were relief packages that were rolled out. Also, more recently, COVID is another really good example where relief packages were rolled out by government at a state and national level. And I guess industry support and recovery is a key component to emergency responses. It would be pointless for us to forge forward with an eradication of the disease if there were no industry left at the end of that eradication program.
Yes, exactly that. There's a lot to think about for the farmers, isn't there? They're busy people.
Absolutely.
Just going about their business being farmers, let alone having to look out for this all the time. But it has to be forefront of mind, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And again, we get it. We understand you've got enough to focus on the here and now without thinking about something that's not even in the country, but looking at the impacts and the devastation that can be caused, that preparedness is vital.
Yeah, and acting really swiftly, because it can be a matter of just, a day, a moment, an hour.
Correct. And we'd rather have a false alarm. We'd rather have, if you're concerned, we would rather have you call through and we investigate it than missing it and allowing that to go on and spread further.
Yeah. Okay. Well, under the Queensland's Biosecurity Act 2014, all Queenslanders have a general biosecurity obligation to ensure that they do not spread a pest disease or a contaminant. And additionally, the Queensland Biosecurity Strategy 2018 to 2023, a 5-year plan to build the framework for Queensland's future biosecurity system. And it was developed or co-developed by the Queensland Government, industry and other partners in the biosecurity system to maintain the resilience of Queensland biosecurity system through new approaches, which is great. And I'd really like to hear a little bit more about this, Fiona, what the purpose of the strategy is and how important is it for the industry?
Yeah, absolutely vital. And as you said, the Queensland Biosecurity Strategy, it's not the Biosecurity Queensland Strategy. And as you say, it was co-created. It's a strategy for everyone. It's not just government. It's not just industry. It's not just farmers. It includes the community and all those touch points. So it's got transformational or strategic themes, and they're along collaborative governance and leadership. They're around every Queenslander playing a part, and that's where the general biosecurity obligation comes into play. It's around better intelligence systems, and they're just a few. So the ultimate goals for the strategy are to prevent exotic pests and diseases, to ensure significant pests and diseases are already in Queensland and managed, and to maintain Queensland's reputation for safe and high quality trade, protect the environment, and preparedness for biosecurity emergency incursions. So it's a really good set of principles to follow.
QFF and its industry members have shown great commitment to being constructive biosecurity partners, including being supportive of the state government's move towards general biosecurity obligations. QFF is committed to a collaborative partnership with the government and recognises that everyone plays an important role. The GBO puts the responsibility on everyone, be they a large-scale producer, hobby farmer, or citizen, to ensure they are minimising their biosecurity risk. And it's not, however, just external biosecurity incursions that we need to be prepared for. As our climate changes, endemic pests and diseases are impacting regions and businesses where they had previously not been a consideration. I'd now like to welcome our next panellist, Dr. Laurie Dowling, QFF Policy Advisor, Intensive Animal Industries. In 2021, Laurie was appointed to the QFF to assist with policy and development of the intensive animal industries, including egg farming, chicken, meat, pork and dairy industries. The recent disease threats of avian influenza, African swine fever, lumpy skin disease, foot and mouth disease, and Japanese encephalitis has meant that biosecurity has become a priority part of her role. And Laurie has previously worked in government as a regional manager in the Animal and Plant Health Service, overseeing numerous emergency responses and ongoing disease control projects. Now, I'd like to start asking you, Laurie, with the first question. What are the main biosecurity concerns facing QFF member groups currently? And I'd love to talk about some examples if you could give those as well.
Hello, everybody. Look, first of all, I'll just reiterate what Fiona said, that Australia is fortunate that it is an island and also that it's in the Southern Hemisphere. And so it's free of many devastating diseases of livestock. And to some extent with everybody, this can make the threat of a disease seem unreal, because something happening on the other side of the world so far away generally does not keep you awake at night. But things can change in an instance. And at the moment, overseas, there's, I just got an email today that there's a farm in Nebraska in the United States where 1.8 million birds, poultry birds, are having to be destroyed or killed because they have avian influenza. And this brings the outbreaks in the United States now to 50 million birds killed just this year. And there's a similar situation in Europe. And it fortunately hasn't come down to the Southern Hemisphere, but it could. You know, it's mostly carried by migratory birds. We're very lucky that our migratory birds, which do go up to the Northern Hemisphere, aren't on the European United States flyway. But that doesn't mean it can't happen. And another example of how things can change in an instance is that earlier this year, the disease Japanese encephalitis was diagnosed in pigs almost simultaneously in 3 states within a week of each other. And yet before, this had only ever been found very sporadically, once or twice in the Torres Strait Islands. It is in Indonesia. And the belief is that it may have been a weather event that blew the mosquitoes across from Indonesia into Australia and simultaneously affected our pig population. And the Japanese encephalitis, for people that don't know, is also a human health hazard. And while most people won't get the disease if they're bitten by the mosquito, if you do get the disease, there's a very high mortality rate. And people have died in Australia this year from Japanese encephalitis when it's never been here before. So disease can enter through a number of different ways, can enter through overseas visitors, and that's the probably the most common way that disease enters. So people bring in food packs, and you've probably all seen biosecurity, border security, where people bring in these things, and yes, they are infected with overseas pathogens that would cause devastation to our industries. But it can also come in through migratory birds and the large climate events like I explained for Japanese encephalitis. But the problem is we don't know which disease will occur in Australia next, or if at all. And so the strategy for everybody is to be vigilant and have very good defences through the biosecurity procedures on your enterprises. and we'll always be surprised. We risk assess the most likely ones, and certainly foot and mouth, lumpy skin disease in Indonesia and African swine fever are very high on our high risk diseases. But no matter what happens, it could easily be something completely different, and you just have to be very vigilant, especially to large mortalities or something that is different. For example, lumpy skin, you may not be aware, but it's characterised by lumps appearing on the cattle. And so if you weren't aware of it, it'd be different, and it'd be certainly worth reporting. Well, definitely report something unusual.
So I guess it could, excuse me, it could catch you by surprise. You know, if it's rare and uncommon and not seen very often, you're not knowing to look for it, which one of the biggest problems, isn't it? Awareness is one thing, but being on it is another.
Yes, look, it pays to be aware of the high risk ones that we're expecting, like foot and mouth, which is probably the most devastating disease that we don't want in Australia, because one of the strategies would be suddenly to have a stock standstill so that everything would stop moving in Australia of the animals that could be infected by foot and mouth. And of those particular animals, that means that everything's affected, and that's across Australia. You know, your food, your meat supplies, everything gets infected. So they're the ones we fear the most. But as you say, we can get something completely different, and probably one that isn't so devastating to livestock but is to horses is Hendra virus. And that disease suddenly popped up in the mid-90s, and that was completely new. We're the only country in the world that has that disease.
And so, Fiona, you've had that experience, haven't you, working with Hendra virus?
Absolutely, and that's right. I think, you know, Laurie's statements around some of these emerging diseases. Again, I think it gets back to, you know, knowing your stock, looking out for unusual signs, as Laurie said. Definitely those mass mortalities, having an awareness of some of these key signs to look out for. I think the good thing is those basic biosecurity measures will put you in good stead for any of these, whether we're talking about emergency animal diseases that are exotic, that aren't in Australia, or whether we're talking about those endemic diseases that unfortunately affect people as well, or endemic just animal diseases.
Mm. And Laurie, can you tell us about some of the activities industry undertakes to help farmers? For example, business continuity planning and emergency management planning.
Yeah, well, the Farm Business Resilience Program, there's a number of organisations that are running that with their members, and QFF is running that as well. And this biosecurity planning is part of that. And as Fiona said, there's some very good templates on the internet, and Animal Health Australia, which the link went up earlier, it's certainly worthwhile having a look at, because it covers everything, you know, like the risks of livestock, farm supplies, waste management, invasive species, people and vehicle and equipment. So you can go through the checklist and tick off and make sure it is complete. So that is certainly a great defence to have a biosecurity plan, because you identify the risks and you work out how to minimise those risks. And with everything raging around you, if you've got your defences up, you may you're in a much better position not to be infected by these outbreaks. The other thing is, part of my role is to look at the threats and opportunities for the industry, and basically that means I've got to be aware of all the risks the government policies, the legislation, the whole kit and caboodle of what might happen that will upset the economics of a farm enterprise. And one of the things we've recently done is to look at emergency response exercise. And the reason we do that, Australia's got excellent plans. We have a plan called AusVet plan, and it's been written for every possible exotic disease that we know of that can come into Australia. And there are volumes and volumes of specific agreed to processes so that it all becomes a very smooth response machine. But the problem with those AusVet plan is because they were first started in the 90s, I think, they do need updating. And you'll find that the circumstances back in the 90s may not apply. And so there may be gaps now. And so part of my role is to look at the new way farm enterprises are, look at the gaps, look at where we're most vulnerable, what do we need to do, and these exercises help us do that. And then there'll be follow-on work from that to make sure, for example, people are trained in being able to use various equipment. So it's so that's become a significant part of my role.
Okay. And extremely important, like you said, it needs to be updated because we're constantly changing.
Definitely. And
evolving.
And things that were done differently only 10 years ago are now, now the AusVet plan may not apply. So you've really got to identify those, work out how to get around it, and so that you do the thinking before it happens, and therefore you're in a much better way to respond immediately and make the impact as low as possible.
Yeah, exactly. And be, expect the unexpected and be prepared for it.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think it's time to move on because Ian has been waiting so patiently and hasn't said a word yet. So I'd now like to bring in Ian into our conversation. Ian Atkinson, CEO, Nursery and Garden Industry Queensland. As the CEO of the Nursery and Garden Industry Queensland, which represents approximately 1/4 of the entire Australian nursery and garden industry, Ian has more than 30 years experience in Australian agriculture, specialising in plant nursery production, irrigation and environmental management, and former industry development manager for the Nursery Industry Association of Australia. He is co-author of several publications and training packages about water management in nurseries, including Water Work. After leaving NIAA in 2000, he spent 10 years working for the Cooperative Research Centres, concluding as CEO of the CRC for Irrigation Futures. Ian, it's really great. Thank you for your patience. You've probably got some things that you'd like to contribute to the conversation so far, but I first want to ask you, what are the main biosecurity concerns facing the nursery industry in Queensland?
Well, actually, might start off a bit broader, if you don't mind, in terms of the plant
Go
industries.
ahead. Oh, absolutely.
And I suppose there's a real contrast between the biosecurity threat situation for the plant industries versus the animal industries, because, for instance, the animal industries is probably, if you counted the top 10 species of animals that are used for production in Australia, that's probably 99% of the animal production in Australia in those 10 species. Whereas the plant industries is tremendously diverse. And if you include my industry, the nursery industry, you're talking about everything from things like wheat and barley, which are fundamentally grasses, through to things like ferns, which are actually angiosperms, and they originate before flowering plants. They are sort of multi-millions of years old. So you're talking about absolutely thousands of species. Also, in terms of the risk, in terms of the major pests and diseases, I mean, if I was say to Laurie, what are she could probably string off the top dozen diseases that you'd be worried about in terms of an animal context across those 10 species. But again, because the plant plants are so diverse, so is the threats to those, because they range from diseases like citrus canker that only affect citrus species, through to generalized pathogens like xanthorrhea, which can affect pretty much anything that has a green leaf. So it's a several orders of magnitude complex in terms of by the time you build that into a matrix in terms of what might happen. In terms of what's worrying our industry, and I think the plant industries in general, if we go back to those 3 tiers of biosecurity, which is international in terms of what we're doing at our borders, biosecurity in terms of our state borders, and also even some of the regions within states, and then what we can do at the farm level, then I think what worries the nursery industry, and certainly what I think also worries most plant industries, is actually what's going to hitch a ride on freight coming in on our ports. It's freight at ports that has been the major cause of infestations of new exotic pests. For instance, at the moment we have a thing called shot-hole borer in Perth. We've had brown marmorated stink bug in New South Wales, which we now believe has been eradicated. And if you look at the classic Queensland example, which is red imported fire ants arrived in Queensland via the port of Brisbane. And if you look at the statistics in regards to the volume of traffic that's coming into Australian ports, it has increased substantially over the last 30 years. And with that comes increased risk. Now, that's particularly of concern to nurseries, because the vast majority of nurseries, in our case, for instance, the majority of them are within 120 kilometres of the Brisbane CBD. So any new pest that arrives in the case of brown marmorated stink bug, it arrived on a pallet full of machinery for somebody to make something. I can't remember what the machinery was. So we're obviously early exposed in terms of things that comes that way. In terms of the state biosecurity risks, our biggest concerns are dealing with the requirements of our interstate colleagues in terms of the hoops we have to jump through in order to sell product. And to give you a really good example of that, virtually nobody in Queensland sells product into Western Australia, because Western Australian quarantine arrangements are some of the toughest in regards to in-state plant movement in the country. Some people would suggest Western Australia is a little bit special, but that wouldn't be me. Then in terms of what occurs at the local level, the thing that would worry most people in terms of the local level is that when they're importing new plant material into their business, because often they're part of a supply chain, they're not a single isolated business, that's the biggest risk point for nurseries in particular, but also the likes of, if somebody's growing a new avocado orchard, then you only get one chance to keep certain things out, and that's when the new plants arrive from the nursery for you to start to plant them out. So that's a real pinch point for biosecurity concerns at the farm level.
And how aware, are the farmers of this? Are they sort of diligent in checking?
Look, in terms of the nursery industry, it would be fair to say, and look, there's about 1,200 growers in Queensland, and they're like any members of the population. They vary tremendously in terms of their level of interest, understanding, and so on. And also depends on what's going on. So, for instance, citrus nurseries, which is a relatively small number of them, there are very high requirements for them to supply, particularly into the commercial industry. And we have had some disease outbreaks in the citrus industry in the last 10 years. So it's very much front of mind. And in the case of, for instance, fire ants are currently contained to a relatively small area in southeast Queensland, a big chunk of Greater Brisbane. So if you're in that area, or even more importantly, if you're on the edge of that area, you're probably very conscious of those issues. But that's not to say there's a lot of people that are completely oblivious to it, because there are.
Yeah. Wow. It's amazing. And what methods are nurseries using to control these risks?
Well, it comes back to some of the basics, like Laurie talked about, in terms of the basic structure of a farm biosecurity plan is the same. whether you're a cane farmer, a beef farmer, or you do a bit of both, or you're a chook farmer. The basics
Small
are the
or
same.
large. Yeah.
So we would always recommend that people consider doing that. Again, the major pinch point for nurseries is if where they are part of a supply chain. And to give you an example, somebody might be growing trees in 45 and 100 litre containers for the landscape industry. They may well be buying tube stock, so plants about this big, from a tube stock nursery that they then plant on to grow on, because I've decided that their main business is growing the larger plants, not starting with the small ones. So obviously when they buy those young plants in, there's an opportunity to put them in a separate area, to monitor them closely for a week or two, and to look for anything unusual. Because again, unlike the animal industries where there's a number of, if you like, headline diseases where I'm getting plenty of information about what lumpy skin disease looks like in its early stages because it's out there. But in terms of what diseases might be on my xantharias, there are many. So really what we need to do is to train people, especially staff who are handling product all the time, to look for the unusual.
Yeah.
So whenever you see something that is a new pest or a new disease or just something unusual, and again, exactly the same point that Fiona and Laurie made before, which is far better for somebody to say, hey, I think this is a problem, and then find out that it's not, than somebody to go, oh, it's not my job to worry about it, which is, again, that shared responsibility for biosecurity.
Yeah, it's a really good point to reiterate. I think, don't feel like you're being stupid by raising an alarm or raising the alarm. If it comes to nothing, it doesn't matter.
No, exactly. And
if it does, are huge.
And particularly staff that work at these things. And I think that's whether that's staff at an abattoir, staff at a nursery. For instance, I've got one of my board members has a business at Burpengary, just on the edge of Brisbane. He's got 175 staff. Now you can imagine the volume of product that they're dealing with on a daily basis. Now, if it's only say the business manager and the pest and disease manager have this awareness of what to look for and look out for the unusual, they're going to miss things. What we need is the vast majority of those 175 staff to at least know that if they see something, it doesn't matter how busy you are. If there's a truck B double waiting to be loaded up, but if you see something unusual, say something, raise it up the channel, get somebody else to have a look at it.
Yeah, because I guess that's probably one of the challenges, making sure that everyone has that awareness, with each farm. So what about some of the other challenges in helping to maintain healthy stock and ensuring market access?
Yeah, and look, market access is the big one, which is I sometimes get involved in discussions and people start talking about biosecurity concerns, and you have to ask the question, at what level you're talking about? Is it international, state, or is it the local level? And the vast majority of people, when they talk about biosecurity, think it's the Commonwealth government's job to keep stuff out, which it is. But in regards to our industry, the thing that would occupy far more of people's time is meeting the interstate biosecurity arrangements. And again, the best example in the current situation is red imported fire ants, which are a very serious ant pest for which there's no evidence that we as an industry have actually moved it. And yet we're subject to exactly the same draconian measures as industries that have been proven to move it. And some of our interstate colleagues get inventive, shall we say, in terms of thinking of ways and means to, understandably, they don't want the pest there. I get that. But there should be some rationale to quarantine measures, and that's part of what our industry is arguing a case for on a regular basis, is more rational decision making about interstate quarantine requirements. Yeah,
and I'm sure that Laurie and Fiona agreed to that as well.
Yeah, I guess from my perspective, that's right. Those restrictions or requirements need to be risk assessed. Nothing's perfect. We know we can't have 100%. We know we don't want anywhere near zero, but it's all around that risk assessment and making those right decisions. Again, for the broader industry, so those that are affected within the zones and those that are are safe and protected and that aren't dealing with the pests.
And Ian, what would be a nursery's owner's biggest current fear?
It's probably at two levels, one of which is, again, I suspect they have a bit of a nagging worry about what's going to come in through the ports next.
Because you never know.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And you don't know when you're going to pick it up. For instance, again, fire ants were picked up. I think they've actually been in Brisbane for about 10 years before they were detected.
Is that a fact? 10 years.
And it depends very much what sort of product you're producing, because it's the variability, but also where you are. So for instance, there are mandated zones for fire ants based essentially on suburban boundaries in Brisbane. If I was a nursery person just the other side of that boundary, I would be very worried about the continued spread of that despite the efforts to control it, because literally overnight you could go from not having to being able to write a certificate and safely send your product into Melbourne and into Sydney. Literally at the stroke of a pen overnight, you would be subject to the same requirements of people that have been dealing with the pest for 25 years. And that would be the thing that would worry me, because it's those sudden shifts in what you need to do that will cause the most disruption to businesses.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Ian. I thought I might bring everybody back into the conversation now, if I may, because it'll be just good to just hear from all of you on the same matter. And the question I have here is, how can producers and growers not only prevent but also manage a potential restricted market access due to an incursion?
I'll perhaps start that off. I mean, because we've certainly had some recent experience with this with, as I said, brown marmorated stink bug in New South Wales and shot-hole borer in Perth. I suppose the first key thing is be aware and be engaged. Now, this is going to sound like an advertisement for our organisation, and it is, but it's also real in that I really worry about people that aren't part of their industry networks, how they find out some of these things are happening. And again, I don't want to harp on about reefer, but I have spoken to people who have started new sort of home nursery operations in Brisbane in the last 5 years and had no idea they had to comply with reefer requirements when those requirements have been in place for at least 25 years. So I think being connected to information sources so that be early awareness that these things are happening, and as soon as you know about it, start to try and find out what happens elsewhere, because that'll be your best indication of what's going to happen in the current situation, right up until the state government issues the actual requirements for what you have to do.
You certainly can't afford to be complacent, but you also have to be prepared to be connected and work together on this. Would you say, Fiona?
Absolutely. And I was going to say a similar thing to what Ian's just said. Be aware, be informed, engage. As government, we will be working closely with the management of our endemic pests and diseases, but also vitally when we've got an exotic incursion, we're working closely with our peak industry bodies. We have industry liaisons involved in the response. Again, as Ian said, even with endemics or exotics, they can change very quickly. So you need to be aware of those movement controls, movement restrictions, and ensure that you are complying. They are key strategies in our, there's a lot of thought and planning that goes into these strategies to eradicate, and you need to ensure that you're complying. So, totally agree.
And I guess just as an individual farmer, it's that constant upgrading, isn't it, and improving your farm so that you can manage this well when a risk happens. When you're at risk, you can step in. You've got the machinery, you've got everything you need in place to manage it. Would that be right, Ian? Would you say?
Yeah, that comes back to that planning. A good biosecurity plan will include at least some idea about what you're going to do in certain situations. Now, you can't plan perfectly, and you can't fill the shed up with control measures on the basis something might turn up. But you can certainly have the plan in place so that you, and again, it's like any other part of a farm business plan, that it's about being prepared, so that if and when the worst does happen, you're not, to the fridge getting a beer. You're actually pulling your plan out and figuring out what you're going to do, and not drowning your sorrows.
Yeah, exactly. So, okay, so I'm a lifestyle farmer. Do I need to worry about biosecurity, or do incursions mainly impact large-scale operations? Well, I think we've already covered that. Doesn't matter how big or small you are, correct?
Absolutely. Our lifestyle farmers, our agribusinesses, our peri-urban, people with pet pigs, anybody from the livestock perspective must have a biosecurity plan in place. They must be aware, and look, sometimes they can pose a higher risk. They may not be as aware as producers. Their livelihoods are not on the line. So absolutely anyone with livestock needs to have a biosecurity plan in place.
Mm.
And I think I'm correct in saying that even if you've got one pig, you have to be registered somewhere so that the authorities know that you're there, at least, that you've got a pig?
Correct. So if you have one pig, you need to be registered with us, with Biosecurity Queensland. You need to have a biosecurity entity, one pig, one cow, any livestock, horses, beehives, and poultry, 100 or more free-flying poultry, birds.
Oh, so with poultry, it's 100 or more.
Yeah.
So I'm right with my 3 chooks.
You're right with your 3 chooks. But have your plan in place?
Yes. The contrast with that is that there's no universal obligation in terms of registering that you're a wheat grower or a cane grower. There are some industry-specific ones, like I'm pretty sure, for instance, the banana industry still has requirements around bunchy top disease. So there are a number of industry-specific ones. But it's actually one of the commonly expressed frustrations in terms of our potential to manage an incursion, particularly in the plant industries, is the authorities aren't always going to know where all the growers of whatever X is are.
Oh, really?
Because we don't keep, and to some extent that's understandable. Again, in terms of our industry, for instance, trying to keep a track of all the people that grow orchids, for instance, would be just administratively a nightmare. But in terms of nurseries, for instance, the only state that used to have a registration process for nurseries was New South Wales. And after a review, they did away with that about 15 years ago, I think now. And I'm pretty sure the authorities that manage quarantine outbreaks in New South Wales still rue the day that was removed, because the simple fact is that we are not only at risk in regards to exotic pest incursions. The other thing we haven't talked about in terms of, we also have responsibility. We also represent a risk in terms of moving those around, particularly anything that goes substantial different distances quickly.
Exactly that. Yes. And Laurie, we haven't heard from you. Is there anything you'd like to add at this stage?
I'd just like to emphasise that the 3 most important components to dealing with biosecurity risks is prevent its entry in the first place. And so if you've got good biosecurity measures on your farm, it won't happen. Then good surveillance, so that you are really on the lookout for something unusual or something happening that's wrong. And the third one is possibly more industry related than farm related, but if something is found, you need a skilled and competent response. So to some extent in the animal industries, if an exotic disease comes in, you will be told what to do if you're in the controlled or restricted zone. So you don't have to worry about knowing what you have to do. You'll be told what you have to do, and you'll have to do that. But I guess it's in that in-between stage where you haven't got it, and something unusual happens. And I would advise then is not to talk to your neighbour or your local agricultural person. I would get on the phone to DAF and ring up their hotline and ask to speak to someone in your particular industry that's being affected, and that's for both animals and plants. And then you can discuss it. If it's animals and the animals aren't well, definitely get your local veterinarian in, and they can assess whether it's something that's a local disease that's happened or whether it's something different again. So, yeah, so my take-home measures message would be make sure you're vigilant, report suspicions, and be prepared if it does happen.
Yeah, exactly. And I might just reiterate too, because we're going to put all these links up for everybody as well, but biosecurity is everyone's responsibility. And if anyone suspects it, then report it. So if you suspect a notifiable animal disease, then you must report it to Biosecurity Queensland. We've put the number there, or the Emergency Animal Disease Watch hotline, which we've also got there. And if you are unable to report sightings by using the forms that are provided, you can speak to a customer service centre representative, and that number is there as well. So, there's access to help. All you've literally got to do is, well, either contact your local vet or just pick up the phone. But eyes and ears open all the time is the key, isn't it? And act swiftly if you're not sure. Make sure that you inquire immediately and just don't let it go. Don't let any time pass if you're suspicious. Okay, I'm going to ask actually, Laurie, you've actually just mentioned some tips, but I'd like to hear from Fiona what would be your top tips for farmers, or a top tip in managing biosecurity risks? What's top of your list?
Yeah, again, I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record, and it is surprising how many people either don't have a biosecurity plan in place or aren't actively using it. They've written one, they've done up a template maybe for a quality assurance program, and it's sitting on the shelf. Have it as an active document, look at it regularly. As Laurie said before, work out all of the points that you need to consider to mitigate your risks, and have a biosecurity management plan in place.
And discuss it with your staff. Make sure everybody's really aware of it.
Make everybody aware of it, including any visitors that you've got onto your property.
Yeah, well, that's another thing, of course. Ian made that really important point. We don't, people arrive from anywhere, so they're coming onto your farm. So making sure we're diligent there. And Ian?
Look, I'll refer to that one again in terms of that pinch point, which is when new plant material comes onto your property, is so critical, and putting that somewhere so that you can keep an eye on it. Even if it's not exotic pest diseases, for instance, we've had outbreaks of insecticide resistant whiteflies and those sorts of things, and that's a homegrown issue. But the only place to stop it is when they first come onto your property.
And how long would you keep it aside for?
Again, it's really hard to generalize because it depends what it is. So, if people are buying cutting type material, for instance, it may be simply until you get a chance to do a visual inspection. For some other things, it might be a week, but it's very, very much dependent upon the actual material. And of course, in some instances, not necessary. So if you're buying seed from an accredited source and it's been properly treated before it's got to you, you're really just checking the paperwork. You're not checking you're not having to put every seed under a microscope yourself. You're relying on somebody else's system to do that. I've just put in the chat link to the our industry's biosecurity plan, which will help guide people. And I'm sure every industry, every major industry, the cane industry, the grains industry, the cotton industry, do a bit of a search in your favourite web search engine, and I'm sure you'll find plenty of material.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for putting that in there. Is there anything else you would like to add at this stage, Laurie?
No, I think we're all on the same page, really. I think we're saying what we all agree on. So yeah, no, I haven't got anything more just at this point.
Okay, well, I might wrap up then. It's been fantastic, and thank you all so much for coming on board and engaging in this extremely important conversation. And just for everybody who's listening, a big thank you again for our panelists, Dr. Fiona Thompson, Director Response Preparedness, Animal Biosecurity and Welfare, Biosecurity Queensland. Thank you so much, Fiona. It's been great to have you on board. And Dr. Laurie Dowling, QFF Policy Advisor, Intensive Animal Industries. And finally, Ian Atkinson, CEO, Nursery and Garden Industry, Queensland. Thank you again to everybody who's tuned in and listened. I know some people will be listening live and some will be tuning in at a later date, but we'd love to see you in our next session. We actually have another business hour. This is the last one for the year, but our next one is Wednesday, the 22nd of February, 2023. That sounds really strange, doesn't it? We've got to get our head around. We're nearly, oh gosh, the year is nearly out. And that'll be at 4 p.m. and we'll be discussing family business risks and key issues. We'll be joined on the panel by Kylie Wilson from Holding Redlick and Susan Bryant from Seeds of Advice and Lloyd Russell from TCB Solutions. And from me and all the team at QFF and our Business Hour team as well, we wish you a happy and a safe festive season, and we look forward to seeing you in 2023. Thanks again. Take care.